Okay, well, we're getting to the point in this pandemic to where I'm not so concerned about the virus as I am the government's response. Up until this point, I've been criticizing most governments around the world for downplaying this and for not preparing their people and for not preparing their infrastructure and for not, having the correct supplies and not doing enough testing and all these things, to contain the virus. But now, we're past the point of containing the virus. The virus is out there. It's spreading. It's endemic to all these countries. It's endemic to pretty much every major European country now. It's endemic to the United States. It's endemic to many, U.S. states, not just the United States itself, not just one state, not just one area. All over the country now we have clusters of community spread. And so this is, looking much less like a potential crisis and more like a crisis that is ripe for exploitation by our authorities. Another guy here on YouTube that I quite like and have watched for a long time, Jason Burmis, came up with a great line. He said that this virus, this pandemic, to the U.S. government is like 1929 meets 9/11. And that this is something that is not just, the kind of economic calamity that I have been predicting, was going to happen in the U.S., the kind of thing that would shake people's, faith in our supposedly invincible economic system, that would discredit the Federal Reserve, that would drive a great wedge between, Americans across the country and would inflame the already, very toxic political culture that we have here. It's not just that. There's a new element that I did not forecast being thrown into the mix because the trigger, of this global recession that we're entering into, and more on that later, the trigger is something that is non-neutral in people's hearts and minds. It's not something like subprime mortgages, which is a rather arcane financial concept that the 99% of people in the United States had never heard of before 2008. But rather, it's an extremely virulent, or perhaps that's a redundant term considering that I'm talking about a virus, but an extremely contagious virus that spreads very easily from person to person and spreads very quickly, which can leave you either dead or with permanent lung damage that inhibits your breathing for the rest of your life. And so the element that brings into this whole calamity is fear. And it's a different kind of fear. It's not a fear over where your next paycheck is coming from necessarily. It's an actual fear for your direct safety. It's a much more basic and animalistic kind of fear. And that makes the government's potential response here so much more dangerous than it would be just to a regular economic collapse. My prediction for if we had I guess you could say a secular economic collapse, not accompanied by, not triggered by this kind of pandemic, would be that the government would try all sorts of measures that, in my mind, would not work this time for complicated economic reasons that I won't get into here, and that would discredit their response. They would look like fools, and that would lead to an awakening amongst ordinary people and a discrediting of our major financial and political institutions. But in this case, with the virus, there's the potential that the government's reaction to this, or rather, the gravity of the situation itself, is so oppressive to people that that they are so fearful of what might come that they in fact are going to double down on their trusted institutions. The people, out of fear over this, this very of the unknown, essentially, of this very, scary on the surface virus. Of course, not as scary as Ebola in terms of the symptoms and stuff like that. It's not that frightening. Ebola really was fearful, and it's a good thing Ebola was not very contagious, or else, we would have had a much worse crisis. But the fact that this virus spread so quickly, across the planet now, I think is going to make a lot of people more open to extreme solutions, quote unquote solutions, that they otherwise would have, scoffed at. Essentially, like 9/11, this creates a great opening to expand, the police state here in America. Now, obviously, we've already seen this across China and Europe now, most of Europe, the major countries. China, of course, was already a police state. They just locked down people more. You couldn't leave your houses, and then, anyone who was sort of picked out of the line was thrown into a koof camp where, there weren't even bathrooms, and people were just sort of left to die. That was something very scary, but we thought, oh, well, that's China. Maybe it can't happen here. Then, what's happening in Europe started to heat up, and I think that that really made me a little more fearful of the government's response, because if you look now, Italy, Spain, France, and soon Germany are all going to be totally locked down. Freedom of movement will be quelled, and with that, all sorts of other rights will be taken away. Almost certainly, freedom of speech. They will restrict internet posts probably to dissuade disinformation. That's what they'll call it. Anyone who says anything against whatever the government's policy is, you're likely going to find your posts removed from social media, and you might get a visit from your local commissar. Now, I don't know that any of this has happened yet, but I'm just saying that these sorts of things, these are the next steps. And if you think that sounds crazy, that's just one step removed from where we are right now. So, try to wake up a little bit to what the possibilities are. Try to see ahead of the curve a little bit. Look over the horizon. Now, the one saving grace when it comes to this, my fears of a growing lockdown in America, is the fact that the Chinese and European cultures are much more submissive when it comes to their government. They are predisposed to be much more obedient to authority than folks in the United States are. And we see this in the fact that in a lot of places, we're seeing a lot of videos coming out on social media of last night, on a Saturday night, of bars packed in major cities all across the country. People completely, who don't care about the virus. And I don't. And I think that's largely because people have already such a low opinion of our institutions, to where they're not going to heed the warnings when they're optional. And so that makes me think that when these warnings, these suggestions, say by people like the governor of New York, that hey, restaurants you should shut down, bars you should shut down, or at least have half capacity. When those suggestions become hard demands, when they become orders, I think that you're going to see people in this country. I'm not sure how many yet, but a certain percentage of the population is going to resist that. And the fact of the matter is that there has to be if there's only a small chunk of the population that resists these sorts of things, these lockdowns, when the lockdown comes here, it will be put down, because the National Guard is being called up by many governors across the country. I know my governor's called up the National Guard. Many states, the National Guard is being called up, and that it will be to enforce these sorts of measures, to enforce these restrictions of freedom of movement. But the resources of the National Guard, and even of the regular military, are limited. They are fairly small in number compared to the 320 million Americans, who occupy this country. So, in that case, if there is a critical mass of people who do resist, well, then what you're going to end up with is significant social unrest, and it will be sustained social unrest, because the government will not be able to control it. And while that, has the potential to be very, chaotic and dangerous in its own way, I prefer, the old, dangerous freedom to peaceful slavery, dichotomy there. I would be happier seeing that than if we just, if Americans lay down and take it, and we accept the police state, and, the troops go around and do sweeps of homes for weapons and possibly extra food, and then essentially just dole people out whatever they need day by day. I don't want to get to the point to where we're all living off bread lines because supply chains have broken down, because they've had to lock down so much of the country that production has halted, that there is no more economy. Places across this country are already being shut down. They're not being locked down totally like they are in Europe or China, but where I live, all the schools are closed for at least 2 weeks, and it's going to be extended, I assure you. In other parts of the country, localities are closing down their schools and other events. Certainly all major events are being canceled. E3's gone, Coachella's gone. And so I do think that people are being conditioned, perhaps not intentionally. I'm not saying that there's some grand conspiracy here. I do think that this is just the way that the event is evolving, that people are getting used to the idea that there will be lockdowns in certain parts of the country, and eventually that could spread everywhere. But keep in mind, the more the country gets locked down, the thinner the authorities' resources will be stretched, and the harder it will be to enforce, because, like I said, Americans overall, there's going to be a lot of people in this country who are not going, psychologically even, let alone even if it's, just a matter of consent or principle or hatred for the federal government. There's going to be a lot of people either way who are not going to be able to be quarantined and won't do that willingly. And so, I would say that, materially, there just aren't enough resources to keep everyone locked down in this country who doesn't want to be locked down, and that's going to create lots of chaos and perhaps further panic. And so if I'm putting myself in the shoes of the authorities, and I'm looking at the potential that we are going to have to lock down parts of the country, you don't want to lock down the whole country at once. You probably want to avoid that. You only want to do certain areas at a time so that you can focus your resources, so that you can bring in resources from other states to close down, say, the city of New York, or Chicago, or Seattle, or Los Angeles, although Seattle probably won't be that hard to lock down. And of course, keep in mind that when the density gets down, it's a lot easier to shut down a city than it is to shut down a suburb, and it's even harder to shut down a rural area. The less densely populated, the more your resources are going to be spread out, and the less effective, essentially, every man is going to be in keeping people confined to their homes. And so this all is really, the kind of stuff I'm thinking about when I say that I'm becoming more concerned about with what the response will be here in the United States, here where I live, by my government, than I am concerned about, the way the virus is spreading. Because, the genie's out of the bottle on the virus. It's here. It's spreading domestically. A county not too far from me has community spread. There is a whole cluster of 30-something people in Broward County. I've been in Broward County, plenty of times in my life. I've spent quite a bit of time there, family there. So, it really is starting to feel like, hey, it's not going to be too long before we have a cluster where I live specifically, because it's already that close. And it's at that point to where, you start worrying that, once things, because like I said before, I do agree with the people who are saying New York is going to be first. They're going to lock down New York before anywhere else, even though, oddly enough, the schools are still open in New York, which, here in Florida, the schools are shut. They've been shut. They're not going to reopen for anytime soon, if you ask me. But in New York, they're still open. But still, New York is the place that has got a hot spot to where things are going to spread the fastest, because their population density is so high there. And so once they rip off the Band-Aid and you start seeing the first, mandatory quarantines, it's going to spread to other parts of the country. Now, I certainly think I'm going to have more notice here than other folks do. Thankfully, things are not, I'm not in one of the least hard-hit places yet so far, even though we're very early on in this, but I'm certainly not in one of the worst places to be as far as this whole outbreak is concerned. But I mean, hell, I didn't even mention it. We've got 3,000 now confirmed cases in the United States. Still a huge low ball. That number is going to shoot way up. It's going to go sky high because we're just now starting to get people tested, and those test kits are still rolling out. There's parts of the country that certainly do not have access to test kits right now. The governor of New York, by the way, is openly saying now that they're going to run out of ICU beds. They do not have enough ventilators to treat all the people who are going to get this. He is saying that right now before they run out. So there are going to be people in New York, who die because the medical system is overwhelmed. If that's not a reason to shut down a city or an entire state, I don't know what is. I think that the point when that starts happening, you're going to see demands. Actually, you're already seeing demands on social media from individual people saying, I forget the exact hashtag, but it's something like shut down New York City or shut down New York, because, people are scared. They're begging for a king to come and enforce the rules on them, to tell them how to live, to protect them. So with that said, if you gained anything of value out of this video, I'd appreciate you clicking that like button and sharing this video. And if you haven't already, please do subscribe, because I do upload every day and I'd hate to have you miss one. So I'll see you folks back here tomorrow.